is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Soldiers in Mali staged a military coup on the 18th of August, toppling the government of President Boubacar Keita, whose win at the ballot in 2018 has been vigorously contested. The dramatic incident capped a turbulent decade for the West African country. The last few years have been marked by terrorism, corruption, and a flagging economy, causing deadly clashes between demonstrators and government forces in recent weeks. Analysts have also expressed concern that foreign involvement has further destabilized Mali and the greater Sahel region. So what are the reasons behind the latest coup in Mali? And what lies ahead for the West African nation? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, soldiers who ousted Mali's president and government in a coup have promised to oversee elections within a reasonable time, as calls abroad grow for a swift resolution to an acute political crisis. My colleague Deji Badmos takes a closer look at the history of military involvement in politics across Africa.
They're supposed to protect their country's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but in the past, Africa's militaries have taken center stage in matters of governance. And often when these interventions happen, the soldiers and their civilian collaborators justify their actions as trying to right the supposed wrongs of the elected government they topple.
No, there cannot be any justification. Everybody, we know that a military coup is an aberration. It's anathema to democratic governance.
They are not trained to govern. By training, their training is to kill. Quelling insurrections and not the rest. Unlike the police, who are trained for civil events. Now, for that same category of persons to take over the reins of, governance in a state, what democratic experience do they have?
Experts often blame military interventions as a reason for Africa's weak democratic institutions and poor development.
If you look at Nigeria critically, today the military is fighting Boko Haram. But look at it very carefully. The military takeover of this country actually plunged this country to where it is today. For me, they've done more harm than good. Because when you look at the trend of events and the number of years they've been in position, the kind of activities that took place throughout, you will discover that much of the problems, much of the crises we have in Nigeria could be in a way attributed to military takeovers. Now, the same thing is now being played out in Mali.
But many military interventions like the one in Mali enjoy the support of the citizens. Critics say the Mali military is capitalizing on a wave of discontent against the elected government.
The democratic institutions in these countries are not strong enough yet. And so you find out that the very few countries where we have not had military coup are countries with stronger democratic ethos and institutions. So that gives you an idea. It also gives you an idea of the decline of the so-called democratization of the African political space.
The latest coup in Mali is the second in just 8 years. There's been strong condemnation from West African leaders. Regional bloc ECOWAS has imposed sanctions and threatened trade restrictions.
The reputation of the international community is at stake over this matter, whether it is the level of the United Nations, the African Union, ECOWAS, but more so ECOWAS because that is the regional organization that Mali belongs to. So ECOWAS has no choice than to tighten the political and diplomatic pressure on the military dictatorship in Mali.
How ECOWAS deals with the situation in Mali could affect how future military coups in Africa might play out. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
And joining me now to unpack the recent coup in Mali are from Paris, Professor Joaf Toka. He's a professor at the American Graduate School. From Abuja, we have Paul Ejime, an international affairs expert. And joining us via Skype from London, Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow at the Africa Program of Chatham House. Thank you all for joining us on the program. Paul Ejime in Abuja, starting off with you because you're watching the development from in Nigeria there. It has been almost 8 years since a rebellion in northern Mali almost split the country into two. There have been several coups, 68, 1991, and 2012. This latest situation shows Mali is far from stability. Why is there a history of coups and instability in Mali?
It's part of the political history of not just Mali, but West Africa and Africa as a whole. The thing, you know, what happened that the trend was, you know, going down with the wave of multi-party system and democracy from the late 90s to 2000. In the case of Mali, it has remote and immediate causes. Remote has to do with the colonization by France. The French administrators, as usual, they didn't take care of the administrative governance system as a whole. They left the people with virtually flag independence, as some people will call it, because there is no economic empowerment, and then socio-economic system is really nothing to write home about. And then north and south, northern Mali, populated by Arabs, Tuaregs, and all that. They have been agitating for independence since Mali became, you know, they wanted to carve, you know, a place of their own because they feel that that way perhaps to become a country. But that never happened under the under colonial administration, has not happened now, and that has continued to fester. So that separatist tendency was behind, continued to fester until the coups that you mentioned, and now this last one. So it's rather like a roller coaster. And then so there are socio-economic, political, administrative issues that have to do with the governance in Mali.
So let me go to Paris and to Professor Toka here, because an issue that has come up is that Mali's problems stem from the colonization period with France, and that France, when they left Mali, did not put in place strong governance structures.
Well, unfortunately, I cannot disagree with this. We know, and this is the case in Mali, this is the case perhaps in a more serious way in Mali, but it is in the case with other ex-colonized African countries. Let the colonial power be France or other colonial powers. But specifically regarding Mali, indeed, the responsibility of the French as they were preparing to leave and left, and following up the moment they had left Malian soil, the French responsibility is certainly engaged. But I would say, as we are speaking right now, about 60-year perspective, right? Mali's independence goes back to 1960. Then, of course, there are some accumulated local responsibilities, let them be in Bamako, the capital, or in both northern and southern parts of Mali. And the lack of efficient governance in Mali is being aggravated over the last 10 years or so, of course, by the fact that we're speaking about external, radical, violent intervention, mainly in northern Mali, but not only and exclusively in northern Mali. So we have decolonization and the charge of history, and the fact that Mali is isolated with no exit to the sea and surrounded. Look at the map,
right,
and get 3/4 of the explanation. And on top of everything, external intervention from both Western and, not to be compared, the extreme jihadist groups.
So talks between the military, Paul Melly, and West African leaders ended without a deal as to exactly how Mali is going to be governed. President Keita has, has also stated he may not be returning to power. What do you see as the way forward, Paul Melly, for Mali?
The key challenge is to agree the details of a political transition, and there's no real disagreement over the fact that there should be a period of time relatively limited, which will be followed by new elections to choose a new president and parliament under the Malian constitution. But there is some disagreement between the West African mediators from ECOWAS, led by former President Jonathan, and the military who are now in charge in Bamako over how long that transition should be. The military have suggested 2 years, but ECOWAS, the mediators, are looking for something more close to 1 year, because that would be the norm in West Africa. As they have pointed out, there are actually ECOWAS protocols, ECOWAS guidelines, agreements on what happens in situations of this kind. And in the last two big unconstitutional changes of power in Francophone West Africa, in Burkina Faso and in Niger, in both cases, the transition was somewhere around 14 months, so close to a year. And I think, in fact, a year itself in Niger. So that's really what ECOWAS are looking for. But there's also some detail to be sorted out about what form the transitional government should take.
So, Paul Melly, are you seeing, though, that what is happening in Mali at the moment? Because Colonel Assimi Goïta has declared himself the new military, the leader of the new military junta. Are you seeing the potential opening of a military dictatorship in Mali?
No, I don't think that's really on the cards at all. Firstly, there's a very practical economic reason. Mali is part of a single currency bloc, the CFA franc West African bloc, and that means that the central bank of the country is not even in Mali, it's in Senegal, and that central bank has the ability to imply very, very powerful sanctions. So they can freeze the banking system. Effectively, they can stop all payments for business, payments of salaries, whatever the regime in Bamako says. But the bigger truth is that the soldiers are not really interested in establishing a military regime. West Africa has quite a long history now, 3 decades of basically mostly multi-party democracy. And Mali was one of the main countries to follow that approach. And there isn't any sign that there's either popular support for a military regime, nor even much will among the military to run the country beyond this very short opening of the transition. There may, however, be some haggling about the balance of power within the transitional period. The soldiers may be looking to try and keep, if you like, some sort of voice or stake in the transitional administration for a year or so.
All right.
But I don't really think there's a chance of a military dictatorship.
So, Professor Toka, the international community wants to support ECOWAS as the main vehicle in West Africa, and France has gone to the UN Security Council. One would ask, what specifically has been France's role, post-independence role in Mali, and why does France continue to remain involved in the Mali situation?
Well, if you look at it through French perspective, which is, of course, not parallel exactly to an African perspective, Africa and Sahel region in particular is the front line of French foreign policy when you look at it on planetary scale. This is the region of the world in which the French Empire of the time still has significant political, social, military and economic power when you look at things globally. Now this is, of course, doesn't have a lot to do with the African perspective. So we know that for decades now there is a debate in France and in Africa, in ex-French colonized Africa, as to the France-Afrique famous relations, namely the specific relations which link Paris with existing present regimes in Africa, and the need which has been diagnosed decades ago to cut down on those and push forward other scenarios, amongst them mainly democratic scenarios. And this is still going on with no frank way of being decided and executed. I'll add just one element in relation to what my distinguished colleague in London mentioned a few minutes ago regarding the fact that no, there are no perspective right now or regarding military coup which goes further up, namely with a power take by the military, by groups of officers, the ones who are now seemingly in control or others. I would nuance that a little bit, in spite of the fact that indeed Western African countries had thought the entire world that there could be progress in democratic terms, or at least what the West calls democratic terms, over the last 2 decades. I would be more nuanced, because the fact that the officers decided upon a 3-year transition period could be interpreted, it's a long time, 3 years, and it's well more longer than what has been announced by other parallel, similar or unsimilar group of officers which have taken power in different parts of Africa. So I would be more cautious about it. At least I'm on the record now for saying attention.
All right, Professor Joaf Toka, do stay with us, and we'll continue with this discussion in a moment. For now, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll look at possible solutions to the crisis in Mali. Stay tuned.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me on the program, Professor Joaf Toka in Paris, Paul Melly in London, and Paul Ejimer in Abuja. Before the break, we looked at some of the causes of the coup in Mali. Let's now look at what some long-term solutions for the country may be. Paul Ejimer, we've seen the swift reaction of ECOWAS. We've seen the international community trying to restabilize Mali for the last 10 years or so. What do you see as some of the solutions to Mali's current predicament?
I think they will begin with a proper diagnosis. I think it hasn't been done, because it will surprise you that about 15,000 UN MINUSMA forces are in Mali, and yet they did not stop this. And then there is about 5,000, French troops. AU is there, and then there is also what you call the G5, the Sahel nations, all fighting, trying to stop terrorism and then insurgency. But they have because part of it is Mali's problem is insurgency, but also internally you have this governance issue. It's not government; it's about governance. Governance speaks to what the social contract between the government and the governed. It's not being respected by the African elite, the African leaders. I think that is part of the problem. That is why you have poverty, there is unemployment, there is no social safety net, there is no, there is corruption, cronyism, and then there is accusation that the money that Mali gets under Keita to fight insecurity is also being used to arm the military to begin to suppress the Malian citizens. So these are some of the problems. And until you diagnose them properly, you will not be able to find any solution. And now, ECOWAS has gone in. I think I told you that the question of reinstating Keita is out of the way. They need to find, and then the military also asking for 3 years is also out of the way. I think they have to meet maybe 12 months or thereabouts, or at the most 18 months should be enough for the military to wrap up and go back to the barracks. That is where they belong. Military is for defense of the territorial integrity. It's not to begin to, go into government.
Professor Toka, is it time for France to release the rope from Mali?
Well, it all depends on which way do you bring down the metaphor of releasing the rope, right? If it is being transformed politically and economically in modernization, perhaps in some of the projects which are on the agenda for some time regarding currency, yes. If it's in terms of disinterest, of getting a larger distance between what is happening in Europe or outside Western Africa and Mali, then I'm not sure that French dissociation or further dissociation from Mali in the first would be necessarily beneficiary. There is, I mean, if there would have been some kind of a compromise formula to put it in, I would say that there should be some wise, very wise equilibrium between what should be sustained in the overall process of detaching the ex-colonial power from its ex-colonies, including Mali, and all these elements with modern times and new factors and new parameters which are proper to the 21st century impose it. But perhaps with some of the more positive experience we have seen over the last 2, perhaps even 3 decades in some Western African countries, not Mali, which could serve as a local sort of regional model. But are there chances for all these to get into a better equilibrium? Mediocre chances, I'm afraid.
All right, Paul Melly, we've heard about France's role here in Mali. 15,000 UN MINUSMA forces in Mali, French troops there, the African Union, the G5 Sahel nations. A lot of troops and a lot of countries are trying to, to deal with the Mali situation. Paul Melly, does it look like, 50 years after, independence, Mali still cannot solve its own problems?
I think in a way that's an unfair assessment because Mali, although it has had in the past, since independence, sporadic periods of unrest in the far north, the crisis that we've seen really over the last 10 years is something that wasn't really there remotely on this scale before. So this isn't really a case of Mali never having developed since independence. It's more a case of Mali being confronted with a really unprecedented crisis that has not just intensified, but has spread out in geographical reach now to affect probably half or more of the national territory, but in very different forms. And so, although you've got this array of international players now present, as you mentioned, the UN, the French, the G5, etc., etc., these are actually fulfilling different roles, so that in a way it's actually helpful that the French, in other words, a foreign country, are taking on some of the most assertive military operations in fighting the jihadist groups, whereas the role of the UN peacekeeping force is much more concentrated on trying to re-stabilize the north and the center after the previous rounds of conflict with separatists who are now in a peace agreement with the government. So I think the different bits of the international engagement, if you like, play complementary roles. And it's true that Mali is struggling to cope, but to some extent, that's not really to do with its immediate post-colonial history. It's much more of a comment on the fragilities of Mali now here in the 21st century.
All right, so I'm going to get your final comments, all of you, but very briefly though, and I'll start off with you, Paul Ejime. In Abuja, Mali has been confronted with an unprecedented crisis. Your final thoughts, and what do you see evolving in Mali?
Well, I think is to Mali themselves, they owe, nobody owes them a living. They owe the world a responsibility to put their house in order. That is one. And then the international community, in their interventions, they should also have the interest, they should put the interest of Malians at the center of whatever intervention or mediation that they are doing. And so these other groups, the UN, the AU, France, and ECOWAS, I think there have to be coordination in the intervention, and then let there be synergy. Let there be, some inclusivity in what they are doing to be able to now reach a compromise that will, because the problem will not be solved today. It has taken some time. Some of them are deep-rooted. Insecurity is a global issue, terrorism.
All right.
It will take time, but at least let them start bit by bit with a transitional government that will hold election. Election really, by the way, do not equate to good governance. So they have to look at it holistically and be able to come out with a solution that will be lasting and enduring for peace in Mali and then in West Africa and then the Sahel.
Professor Toka, your thoughts?
Well, in the short, medium run, I don't see a change on the horizon on the part of the international community as a whole, or France in particular, in terms of wishing or even just putting into action some extra intervention. I think that whatever political or semi-political solutions might be found, which would avoid further a deepening of a French intervention or international presence on Malian soil, would be preferable when the international community is concerned. In terms of the internal Malian Sea, I would watch very closely what the officers are doing, of course, perhaps what the Constitutional Court is trying to do with negotiations. Yes, indeed, with those mediation efforts of the AU, of ex-President Jonathan, among others, and would just let's see whether we can stay within the framework of an internal Malian dialogue before some more dramatic and unwished events break this potential of internal dialogue, which would bring a more stable solution, at least on the medium range.
Paul Melly, you have the final word.
Well, I think what we can say is that although it's certain that Mali will find a functional way forward through to a peaceful and secure transition, there is a real opportunity for that. And the initial indications after the talks over recent days between the military and the ECOWAS mediators are that it is quite possible that Mali, not certain, but it is quite possible that Mali will actually find a way to a viable and well-organized transition and credible elections afterwards, which will allow, once those are agreed, the agreements on those are in place, would allow the country and its international partners to focus on tackling its big long-term problems.
All right, gentlemen, very insightful thoughts indeed. And that's all we have time for this week on the program. But thank you to my guests for your thoughts. Professor Joaf Toka, professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. Paul Ejime, an international affairs expert joining me from Abuja in Nigeria. And Paul Melly, consulting fellow at the Africa program of Chatham House, joining me via Skype from London. Well, remember, we'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and on Twitter. And you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, stay safe and goodbye.